Hi everybody. I'm Richard Whitehall. I'm a designer and a partner at Smart Design, and on behalf of myself and my co-host Catherine Eisenberg, pleased to welcome you to a virtual smart salon called Beyond the Interview: Using Creative Methods for Deeper Insights. So before I introduce the panel, I just wanted to say a bit about the event series. So we've been running a series of events over the last probably about the last 6 months, which has been focused on design research. And really, this came out of a survey that we did at the beginning of the year, talking to different people across the industry and synthesizing out 5 different themes. And the theme that we're doing today is the last in the series. So we've had a really amazing group of panelists across all these topics. So we'd encourage everybody to go back and look at some of the summaries and transcripts, and we'll be putting out a piece that kind of summarizes the whole thing after this one. So today we're talking about beyond the interview. Design research, really strives to go beyond, what people say and unpack some of their kind of underlying needs. And these are really the things that sort of create those surprising and unexpected things sort of in the marketplace. And it's kind of really at the heart of innovation, I think, trying to understand some of these kind of deeper things. At the moment, we're kind of working in a world where we're all doing remote research mainly. So it's sort of challenging to do some of the observational stuff that we've kind of relied on in the past, but it's also sort of generating a lot of new creative ways of engaging with people, and there's a ton of opportunity, I think, in some of these new kind of methodologies as well. And really, the panel discussion today is going to be all about how do we engage people in a more kind of meaningful way, whether that's talking about multi-sensory engagements, whether that's talking about following people outdoors, or whether it's putting them in a really sort of playful, creative situation and getting the most out of them in that kind of sort of context. I will quickly just introduce the 3 panelists, and then each of them is going to sort of talk about an example of a project where they've used an unexpected or interesting technique to engage people. So starting off, Emily's an experienced designer and an artist who creates multi-sensory experiences, best known for her delightful innovation work in food and technology. She uses food as a medium for designing experiences overall. Welcome, Emily. Sarah guides multidisciplinary teams through the fuzzy front end of research and translates cultural insights into meaningful and actionable solutions. Welcome, Sarah. And then Colin is a designer with a passion for playful innovation, for business and social impact, and he works both in design practice and education now. So welcome to all of the panelists. We're really pleased to have you here this evening. And now I will hand it over to each of you just to go through your project example before we get into the main discussion. So I'll just zip through the next few slides quickly. And maybe we'll start with Emily.
Thank you, Richard. Super happy to be here. So as said, my name is Emily Baltz, and the project that I want to share with you today is pictured here in small thumbnail form. But I think my work has spanned across the industries of design and art for about the past 15 years. And most recently, I've been interested in exploring how we use the senses as a material for design, specifically how we communicate emotion and use our bodies to engage within that. And so this project pictured here is actually called the Dream Machine. It's a series of interactive instruments that you operate by actually pumping a bicycle pump. And in doing so, you play a symphony of emotions. So from happiness to disgust, 10 different stations that by pumping them shoot out corresponding sound, smell, and light. As not necessarily a definition of that emotion, but more so as a launching pad for discussion of how we might communicate and interpret feelings like hope, respect, embarrassment. As I said, disgust is also in there and was probably the hit of the show, if I'm to be honest. But really, I think a great example of my own work and the way that I try to weave interactive technologies with kinetic technologies and elicit feelings in people that that create hopefully conversation, communication, and fluency in this intangible space of emotion.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Let's go to Sarah next.
Great. How do you follow that? That's so super creative and amazing. So the project I have represented here is, so I work for VF and I work with a lot of professional athletes like the North Face and the folks at Smartwool and Vans. And this is a project with North Face where we were tracking athletes over time, knowing that we can't always be with these professional athletes because I obviously cannot chase them through the woods as they're running. They're very fast. So you need to come up with different ways to be able to understand their gait and understand them over time. And so we would use this project in particular, we use sensors to understand gait and just kind of like how their feet are moving like as they're running through the woods. And to be able to collect all that data, to be able to understand how we could then translate that back into new footwear for the athletes. So that's the project.
Very cool. And then Colin.
Good to meet you all virtually. The project I want to kind of introduce is, my background is mostly in kind of toy and playful products, but it's always fun to bring that to a setting where that might not be the expected. This is a project I did while I was working at SC Johnson. I was the designer on kind of this innovation project, partnered with a much more credentialed researcher, someone with kind of PhD in social psychology and some other good folks on the team. Anyway, the project really focused on developing products for toilet cleaning, which is just everyone's favorite topic to share ever, right? So we decided to kind of create some objects, some probes to help provoke kind of thoughts and stories around the topic. Anyway, things that we wanted to kind of consider the absurd and silly to try to get them to think in new and interesting ways about the topic. As an example of some of the things we brought with us, we brought a set of toilet brushes, some too long, some too short, some in the middle, and had people kind of just play with them and see what happened. And this image that you're seeing here is one of the participants in the research pondering the value of this too long toilet brush here. Anyway, through this kind of ridiculous exercise, we got to learn quite a bit about people's feelings and relationships about proximity. If you have a really short one, you got to get really close and in there. If you have a really long one, what does it mean when you're out there? And just got to see and understand kind of people's feelings around proximity and learn about that. And the other tools that we brought with us poked at kind of other principles and stuff like that. Anyway, the ridiculous nature of it really kind of brought out very effective conversations and thoughts and feelings around this lovely activity of cleaning the toilet.
Very cool. So these are three really great examples. I think it's like sparking a lot of really interesting thoughts on the topic for me. And I'd really encourage everyone who's attending the webinar, as we go through, please put questions into the Q&A thread, or even any interesting thoughts you have or builds. And we'll stop the discussion in a few different places, and I'll bring in some of those questions. But at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, who's going to facilitate the conversation with a few questions and thought starters, and we'll get going on that. Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. First of all, I wanted to extend my personal thank you to the three of you for being here tonight. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I want to start off with a couple of questions, maybe targeted more at Sarah and Colin, as kind of more research practitioners who live in this world of research more on a day-to-day basis. So I want to hear from you, from your experience, when are more creative methodologies better than maybe the traditional interview format or a survey? And I guess conversely, are there instances where traditional methodologies might be exactly what you need? So maybe Sarah, I'll start off with you.
Sure. Well, I think with traditional research, I think it's really great to use that when you've done a little bit of thinking. Maybe you already have a prototype or you have some benefits and you just kind of need to really get that feedback, like pointed feedback, and you just kind of have to ask the questions to be able to get there. But I think when you are using creative research, that's really great when you're trying to get at something that's a little bit more emotional, or it's just you just have to crack it a little bit differently. You need to like kind of think about like, you want to think about like blue sky stuff, or kind of like things that are that could like that are going to be in the future, like how like stretch people's imagination in different ways. I think that's when you start to use creative methods.
Great. Colin, any builds on that? Differing opinions?
Yeah, I think when is probably like Tuesday and Thursday. That's usually no. Honestly, I think any research like choice on methodology and all that kind of just comes down to authenticity, like what is right for that moment and that engagement. And there's, I always try to think that we're being creative in whatever method it is that we choose, whether that's, kind of traditional interviews or whatever. But, when you're trying to be clever and silly for kind of, I don't know, gag's sake versus it having true value and kind of being a pathway to getting deeper and really trying to explore things uniquely, that, I don't know, you could easily go the wrong way and just trying something new. But when it really can lead down kind of interesting paths, that's when you go to it. That's what I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, and Colin, when we spoke, in our last conversation, I think a big emphasis and a big focus on your practice is this notion of play. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And maybe if you could speak to kind of what mindset you should adopt when you're running these types of creative research sessions and working with people in this kind of maybe new and unfamiliar way.
Sure. I think when a lot of people hear play, immediately we think of like, it's got to be fun and jovial and all of that. And I think that's absolutely a part, kind of more the playful side, whereas play itself is just this notion where we're kind of in simulation or practice mode. Things are safe. We're not going to fail. Risk is low. All of that is going on. So really that mindset of how can we bring people into an environment or be in their environment where we can kind of bring that level of risk down for folks. To me, that's how I kind of think of this notion of play when it comes to design research. The mindsets that really stick out are things around that curiosity and imagination, me having that as the researcher, but also helping participants get into that mindset. How can you help them be curious, not just in, let me just say answers to questions and things like that. So get them in a kind of an active mindset that I think kind of opens us up, lets us be interested and I don't know, explore the possible, I guess is the main goal there. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And Emily, I know in your work, you also do a lot of work doing kind of immersive programs and experiential experiences, for lack of a better word, with people. So I know kind of transporting people is kind of a big part of your work. So any builds on that? Any thoughts on how to kind of pull people out of their shell or pull people out of their current mindset and help them kind of grow their creativity or go someplace else?
Yeah. Well, I think what Colin said is really interesting. And I think Sarah as well, that, these non-traditional methods are used to expand possibilities. And I also like to think of that pretty practically, like how do we do that? And so part of my own work has been to explore kind of the mechanics of how we do that. And I think one of the interesting definitions of play, along with like creating safe spaces, that are risk-free, playful spaces, there's like a sub definition of it that is to move. So I think that's an interesting insight there, that one of, I think, the prerequisites for being in a space of play is how we use our bodies. So changing postures, the simple example is we all have felt it from COVID, like sitting at a desk for 8 hours to like standing, asking people to do things with their bodies, interacting, vocalizing, and also if you want to go down that rabbit hole, smelling things, tasting things. What else can we do with our bodies? Because, the simple example is like the purest example of play as a child. And when a child ultimately in its essence is a learning mindset, that's really open and exploring, and they're using their bodies like crazy, putting stuff in their mouths all the time, like smelling, looking, touching, making stuff fall over. So there's, I think, some interesting, like I said, some interesting insights into that, practically speaking. that can also be, so how do we foster that outside of humor? We can be in playful states when we are active, when we are mobile, when we're engaging with more senses than, you know, traditional methodologies would ask us to.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more, Emily, I guess on your work. I know so much of at least my work at SMART is really having to do with presenting people with physical prototypes or this tactile stimuli to really play around with and get them thinking. But I know your work specifically focuses a lot on the other senses. So smelling things, you're mentioning tasting things, putting things in your mouth. So yeah, I think the interesting question there is how you can really get people to talk about it or articulate what they're feeling or how they're kind of experiencing things through their other senses. Something we were talking about in our conversation last week was not necessarily having kind of the lexicon or vernacular to express some of these thoughts. So I'd love to hear kind of from all of you, but maybe Emily first, how do you get people to talk about things that might be harder to articulate or express?
Yeah, well, emotions are intangible. You know, we as a human race have got a lot of work to do there. So I don't have the answer to that. I think what often I will borrow from, even in my own practice, as well as trying to create dialogue with others, you know, with teams, for example, if we need to align on a certain mood or feeling that we want to create, or even explore what that is for different people. You know, the experience of synesthesia is an interesting thing to look at as a reference point. So synesthesia is a state of being where an individual will experience, you know, sound through color, and they have very direct associations to those. And that's an interesting kind of framework to borrow from, I think, in terms of creative practice, research practice, is an associative approach. So even, you know, you can work both ways. For example, what color, you know, what is the color of love, or what is the sound of love? And just sort of keep going down that road. You know, what do we associate with a feeling in terms of colors, sounds, materials? I use a pretty simple diagram personally that I call a sensogram, that, you know, at the center has the core concept, and then we diagram around that what all of the sensory touch points could be that relate to it. And so it serves as a container for conversation and for dialogue, and also for education and the development of fluency between different stakeholders within a project. Because the unique thing about emotional experience is that it is totally and always will be subjective, based on, you know, the neural pathways that get activated in unique ways in every single individual all over the world. So I hope we will never have the same language, to be honest, that says this is exactly the right answer. But I do think that there is a way to create consensus and some shared agreement therein. And so approaches like that for me have been really beneficial, just to help align and once again kind of create shared vocabulary and consensus around what it is that we're trying to achieve or communicate specifically in that emotional realm.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, I know you mentioned you had some experience working, kind of bringing in these other senses into your research. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking about this project back when I used to work at REI prior, and we did this really interesting travel project where we wanted to better understand people's memories and kind of also have inspiration for kind of the textures and colors and kind of what we chose to put on the bags and the whole kind of collection. And so we used different scents of like flowers and leather and kind of different, just kind of really any scent we could find to see if like, you know, people that kind of like sparked something for people. And it kind of did it bring them back to a travel memory, and did it, you know, some people started talking about their childhood and then talking about different travel memories that they had. And so we used that and then started to talk about color. So using that to then translate that to like, you know, pick these different swatches, or, you know, start to create this like 3-dimensional collage of like what you want, what this like looks like to you. So yeah, it's been pretty interesting. The other thing too that I like to do is I love to blindfold people. So I like to take away the senses as well. So blindfolding people to be able to kind of like really key into the other senses that they have. So to be able to really listen, and I like using it in conversation or group, you know, in groups there. So people can really listen to the other people that they're working with and start to build together through that conversation. But, you know, people become very polite and they listen and they wait for people to talk. But yeah, so there's kind of the like building on the senses, and there's also taking it away to kind of like make the other one stronger.
Yeah, so interesting. Colin, any experiences kind of engaging the other senses in research?
The examples given are awesome. I love
Yeah.
that isolation of the senses. I had a research professor that would, for us to practice how to do research, he would make us go do research with one sense only. And that it's always hard, you know, how do you focus on just what you're hearing? Because you can't shut off the other stuff. But anyway, very cool. The thing that came to mind the most on this conversation is starting with what people do have and letting kind of that build into kind of new and interesting way. The example that comes to mind is I like to use emoticons quite a bit with people to help them express emotion, because like we've been talking, it's a very challenging thing to do. So I'll let them just start with that because it's a world they're familiar with, and then ask them to do things like, now let's create a new emoticon, like one that doesn't exist, so that they have to then explore maybe a part of their sense, you know, it's part of this emotional expression that they're not used to doing. So they have to then draw and doodle. And, you know, I even like doing things like make them use finger paint so that they're getting even more kind of sensory interactions as they're doing it. Sorry, my kids are upstairs making a clatter. But anyway.
They're playing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I guess as you were talking about that, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, bringing maybe someone in, you know, and sitting them down and having them finger paint. Are you ever met with kind of hesitation or reservation from participants? And if so, yeah, I'm curious to hear kind of your tactics for getting them to kind of lower their guard and engage a little bit more.
Sure, and you know, that's not the first thing that you ask them to do, obviously.
Right.
But a lot of it comes to just this notion of invitations to play. You know, I think a lot of us are willing to go to kind of weird places if we're invited. If we're asked to go alone, it's scary, but if we go together, it becomes fun. So a lot of it's just kind of this, I don't know, through how you ask them or invite them to just play along or to do it with me, things like that help a lot. You know, especially when I'm doing research with children, you know, usually some adult figures there as well. So getting them involved as well. And anyway, so they see that it's kind of this accepted behavior in this space. And once you're invited to play, the door's open, and usually people just jump in and kind of go their own path after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Emily, what about from you? I know sometimes you've done some installations or maybe some types of projects that you kind of left to be and not necessarily were there to kind of facilitate the engagement. So any tips from you on how to kind of get people involved and get people engaged and interacting with your projects?
Yeah, for sure. I think there are 2 points of entry usually. One, I borrow a lot of my work is food-based, and I have worked in hospitality for many years prior to this. And I think that the restaurant host is a great archetype to borrow from, you know, the moment that, and your server, right? The maitre d', the server, that the second in a great restaurant you enter, you are greeted, you are welcomed, you're explained, you know, have you been here before? Here is how the menu works, for example. So some kind of upfront instruction, and that, you know, can often be done through casting someone. So human presence, I think, just like Colin is saying, that embodies, you know, the spirit of what's at hand. Are we in a serious place, or are we in like an alive, funny place? All of that are they're theatrical principles too. You know, like this is the theater of life that we're talking about. And then I think the other components of that are form principles from design. I'm trained in industrial design, well, screenwriting and industrial design. So I'm always thinking about how design functions as a prop in these stories and how those props communicate. And so one example that I think speaks to this specifically is I have a project that was made in collaboration with a former Smart Design employee, Carla Diana, who's a wonderful artist and technologist. And we together made Lickestra, the world's first lickable ice cream orchestra, in which you lick ice cream, and in doing so, as you lick, you trigger music, and you play as a group of 4. And so the idea here is that you're not only using a novel interface with your tongue, but you're also, you know, listening to each other, playing with each other. But I think the real discovery in that project was that we didn't need to to tell people how to do it, because everyone knows how to lick ice cream. So leaning into the form, known forms, known behaviors, and piggybacking off of that goes so far, you know, and you there, we can look to shape for that. We can look to experiences for that, you know, the experience of licking ice cream. So I think those are two poles that I often think of, you know, from the casting of something and the script writing to also the form and the shape and how those communicate and must communicate by themselves for, I think, great experiences to happen.
If you haven't seen the video on the ice cream licking, you got to go check it out. It's fantastic.
I just wrote it down.
It shows much more than you would expect to about humans. Talk about a research project. I encourage everyone to bashfully watch the Lick a Strut.
Maybe we'll include a link in our recap. Yeah, I was just thinking about how that could never really fly today. Everyone licking this ice cream and not sanitizing it in between.
Oh, but we did. I'm going to also tell you. Yeah, there were individual portions, no germs.
Great.
Yeah.
That's just where my mind goes these days.
Yes.
Great. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of our conversation, it seems like to this point, has been focused around kind of bringing people in, maybe to your lab or to your exhibit or to your exhibition. But I think a lot of this creative research can also be done kind of in field, you know, in context. Sarah, I know you do a lot of this in your work. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, you know, when you should maybe take the next step and do your research in context, and maybe when you should meet people where they are versus maybe bringing them in and having them do a research in your lab or in your facility.
Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking about kind of like, yeah, it's a lab type projects where we're using sensors and things like that. You know, I think it really has to do with the limitations of the equipment sometimes. You know, sometimes those things are really big. You have like a treadmill and you're testing people's like VO2 max and things like that. You can only do that in the lab, unfortunately. But good news is the sensors are getting cheap and small, and you can start to put them, you know, on body. So like the project I shared at first, you know, we're able to kind of put these little sensors in people's shoes and let them kind of just go run over time. So yeah, I think as much as we can kind of create like a lab outdoors, it's really important. And the other thing that's really cool about that too, as we're kind of testing, we can start to have, you know, conversations about emotions and feeling, and you're there with them, you know, outside. And, you know, it's different, you know, especially the stuff that I do outdoors. Being outdoors is a really different experience than it is being in a lab, you know, like, I mean, you guys probably know the trees change you. It changes your brain. It changes your brain. And so I think, you know, the mindset that you're in when you're outside is just like, we just really need to capture that versus as much as we can versus, you know, going inside. But it's a technology limitation in a lot of cases.
Yeah, aside from maybe sensors or, you know, kind of technical devices, are there any other kind of tools or techniques you use to do more of this kind of in context research, things like cultural probes or giving people cameras? I know is a popular methodology to kind of document some experience over time. So kind of any examples of when you've done something like that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking about some of like the backpack designs and things like that, where, you know, kind of do a build a pack where you kind of have a big like Velcro backpack and you're outside with people, sitting with them on the trail and, you know, asking them to kind of like build the things that they need. And when you're in context and you're thinking about it versus like being inside, it's really different. Like you have your hiking shoes on and you have like your gear on, and you think about like the interaction between the shirt that you're wearing or the pants that you're wearing and the backpack that you have. So that's really important. So yeah, just being able to kind of like stick things on and move things around and have a conversation. And then kind of like, if I take everything away, you know, if I need to take everything away, but you can keep like one thing, what would it be? What's the most important thing? So you can start to prioritize, but it's easier to get in that mindset when you're in the trees.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And outside.
Yeah. Colin, I know you mentioned an interesting piece of work that you did using kind of cultural probes and kind of sensors within the home over time. So maybe if you could talk through that project and your methodologies there.
Sure. Yeah, while I was at Hallmark, we got to work in a cool space of trying to help kids and families connect to the North Pole and the magic that is surrounding all of that during the Christmas season for many folks. And you know, a lot of what we were trying to do is see if there were things that we as a company could kind of insert into those moments to enhance that connection. So we were kind of just playing with what ideas, what devices, what things could we create. And in this point of the project, we had kind of narrowed down to some kind of walkie-talkie or that type of communication. So we embedded in these kind of devices that would end up being kind of dumb or you know, low tech, if you will, some sensors so that we could kind of get a feel for what was going on throughout the season with these families and be able to listen in at kind of hyper moments of activity and be able to see what was happening, who was there, what types of conversations. So the devices themselves would capture this and we could be able to kind of get a feel for what was going on in those moments. So just kind of let them play with it, how they would play with it. And we were just kind of in the background along for the ride to hopefully understand what was going on and get to ask follow-up questions later if we had them. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. There was another one that comes to mind that's a little low tech as well. I got to be on a project where we were looking into and trying to understand the experience of adoptive parents and what that experience was like. And so to kind of, I don't know, get into their heads a little bit, I guess, we sent kits for them to kind of do activities throughout a week. And one of the activities was to, it was a little vial of salts for the bath, and just said, you know, make a bubble bath, pour in the salts, just relax and just think. And then with the empty vial, what we asked them to do was to write out some thoughts to their child into the future, kind of a message in a bottle type metaphor, and put it in the vial. And anyway, so just, you know, knowing that parenthood is stressful and crazy, like giving them a moment to chill instead of, you know, imagine that versus, could you fill out this 20-question survey? You know, the type of emotional kind of conversations and thoughts that they're having are very different and puts them in a very different mental space. Anyway, a couple of examples.
That's a lovely project. I love that idea. Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking, and Emily, I think this probably relates to some of your work as well. You know, when you have participants kind of creating potentially like these abstract artifacts, or even Emily, in your case, watching them kind of interact with an exhibit, how do you kind of make sense of what you're seeing? So kind of understand people's responses or actions, or kind of make sense of that human data that you're collecting by either having them make an artifact or having them interact with something that you put out into the world. Yeah, how do you go about kind of making sense of all of that and making sense of what you see?
Well, sometimes my work is about making nonsense of all of that. So I'm going to answer it with that in parentheses. Great. I mean, you know, the Lickable Ice Cream Orchestra is a good example of that. Like, how do you make sense of it? Like, are people still licking ice cream? Like, are they continuing to be engaged? What are their facial expressions look like? Playtesting is something that is obviously, you know, the lingua franca of all of this. So I do spend a lot of time doing that. The actually interesting to talk about would be the research and development process prior to, for example, this Lickable Ice Cream Orchestra, which was an interest in creating an interactive like food technology project without any real knowledge of what that was or what would be successful or what necessarily we wanted to achieve. So it was a very open-ended exploration. And what we did was set up a mini lab environment with a variety of different materials, dough attached to, like bread dough attached to sensors, sipping soda through a straw, lollipops, you know, cracking crackers. So everything would kind of elicit a sound. And the interesting part with that is wildly what we discovered, and also not wildly, was that the lollipop was the most successful because it was also connected, you know, sound is connected to your mouth most naturally. So there was a certain known relationship of that sensory experience of like sound coming out of your mouth and the lollipop experience being in your mouth. You know, we further developed that and thought ice cream was more playful and more interesting and also had different gestural interactions. But you can also see a lot in people, you know, just by what they gravitate towards, by, again, what their facial expressions are, and then some qualitative feedback, conversations. You know, I'm not a researcher, but I often do that kind of upfront prototyping and research to understand what is successful. And maybe even beyond that, what does kind of this, you know, ambiguous creative exploration, what can it teach me about what the project wants to be too? So, you know, there's a decent amount of listening and looking and, you know, getting out of your own way. Even though I thought it would be X, really it looks like it's Y that's going to be successful. So I think that's one example of going through, you know, a variety of different materials and seeing which one felt most successful and also looked most successful.
Great. Colin, what about you? Any tips for interpreting abstract finger paintings or amorphous balls of clay?
I love Emily's notion of get out of the way. I think that resonates a lot with me on this type of topic. You know, there's so many kind of things you could interpret from all of this, but I think it's similar to kind of an interview where, you know, you're hearing words, you're stringing the words, you're hearing patterns across interviews, and you're seeing similarities or you're seeing outliers. Just it's not that much different from how you interpret and see it than you do with conversation. So those skills translate, absolutely. So don't feel this, I don't know how to do with the physical. It's just a different form of communication, I guess, would be the first thing. And then the other thing that comes to mind is, as I'm choosing materials or artifacts or, you know, probes, props, whatever you want to call these things, there's some sort of underlying structure to it, kind of in mind, like prototyping principles rather than ideas. It's like, what is that, like in the toilet brush example, like proximity. Sure, that matters. How do we get at proximity? How do we kind of provoke them to talk about that? So it's knowing what principles you're trying to get at, and then exploring what materials could help you understand that. Sure, there's moments where just playing around is great, but when that kind of underlying structure is there, and you understand kind of those principles that matter in a topic, that's when you can really start to play with them as almost like levers of like, what if we did that one way up or way down? And you can truly understand kind of the relationship of those pieces within the topic.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a quick build on that. Something that comes to mind is the age-old cliche of show, don't tell, which I think is a real part of this kind of work. Is it, to your point earlier, Colin, you can sit down with a questionnaire, but like how lovely was the gift that you gave someone to create the emotional space of, you know, sitting in a bath and reflecting. So within that, I think identifying really what these high level thematics or missions are, and then kind of busting them open. So how little do we have to say is, I think, always puts us in a really great spot for people being immersed and present in the topic.
Colin, you mentioned earlier, you know, some of the challenges of working with kids. And I'm curious to hear if any of you have kind of thoughts on how you've managed maybe different cultural differences, maybe is not the right word, but, you know, people of different ages, maybe people with different backgrounds, making sure that everyone feels like, you know, the place you're setting up and the research you're setting up is kind of a safe space and a place where they feel comfortable kind of expressing themselves.
I could start with the kids part of that, and obviously it applies to a lot more. But you know, adults and kids aren't that different. We want love, respect, and candy, and that's it's basically, if you stay within that wheelhouse, you're all right. But you know, you mentioned this term of culture, and I think that's kind of a loose term that's hard to kind of wrap our heads around when it comes to research. But you know, the idea of culture is in every project, and knowing that we don't know, I think, is kind of the most important part in any research, that we need to kind of just see what is versus trying to assert ourselves so forcefully, I guess. So how to kind of deal with that? I think just sadly that term inviting comes back to mind of, you know, just being willing to show that you're open and you're willing to kind of receive wherever they are or whatever they're up to. I had a buddy of mine that I got to do a project with in grad school around exploring what cultural elements matter in a project. And it became really challenging because all of them do, but which ones matter most? Anyway, so, and actually it started with a game that you play with yourself first as the researcher to understand your relationship with the topic, so that when you go and you talk with others, you can understand, you know, how different it truly is. I think we assume we know so much, and really we should assume that we know so little and start from that point of view. And I don't know, that's how I have coped, I guess, with kind of the differences between me and participants, or the culture of my organization and the culture of another organization, things like that. It starts here, and then it can kind of emanate outwards a little bit.
It reminds me, Colin, I once had the privilege of watching this game designer present his like LARPing game.
Yeah.
And it was based around being like a teenage kid in a classroom, and you had to fall in love with people. I'm not going to do it justice if I continue to go down the explanation, but he was like a really serious, you know, kind of lanky, awkward guy. And he gave us this presentation, and the presentation was like the game was inspired by this song about stars, and it was like a really cheesy romantic love song. And he was like, so this is what this game is inspired by, and I'm going to ask you to do this, this, and this. And everyone is like, oh, and he's like, I'm going to play the song for you now. And he pressed play. And this man got so into the song, he totally lost himself, just started like a 13-year-old kid at like a school dance, was just like going for it. Dance, 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 totally lost himself. And we were in a group of about 40 people. It was so moving. Everybody was just almost in tears of like the intimacy that he allowed us into, the bravery of dancing, you know, his face off to this super sappy love song. And he ended, and he was like, oh, okay. And then he gave us the instructions, and everyone jumped into it, like not just 2 feet in, but whole body in, and loved it. And I asked him about it afterwards because I complimented him on that. And he said, well, you know, if you ask someone to jump, you have to jump higher. And I thought that was a beautiful principle. And it makes me think of what you're saying too, is that as, you know, when we're in these positions of interacting with people and we're asking them to do things that are outside of their comfort zone, if we show them that we're into it, you know, if we are, as we said earlier, you know, authentic versions of what we're asking, and jump higher, you know, you suddenly have permission. You've kind of inscribed the landscape and shown also that it's safe to do it. So that, I always think of that beautiful, beautiful story in that world.
I was also just going to say too, that like, you need to be ready to pivot. Like we've all had those interviews where you go in and you start to like, you're like, we're going to create this thing. And they're like, what? Like it just doesn't land. And so you just need to be ready to kind of adapt, be empathetic of the situation, and you just kind of like, and make it work. So I think you just have to be adaptive in a lot of different ways. You know, have your toolkit and then see what works. And then you learn from it too, you know, because you evolve over time, and, you know, with all the different people that you talk to and what you do. So yeah, I just pivot, be ready to pivot if you need to.
Yeah, great. I think at this point, I might hand it over to Richard. I know we have some audience questions that I want to make sure we hit. So yeah, over to you, Richard.
Yeah, that's great. So we have a couple of really good ones. So one question here, really, you know, this is, for a start, this has been a really inspiring conversation, but if you kind of cast your minds back to when you were starting out in your careers, it seems like some of these methods require a lot of confidence, and you have to be able to you know, develop that over time. And I was wondering, this kind of question is really about how do you know, how can you create a path as a young designer to sort of building confidence in some of these methods, and maybe what are some of the things that you experienced that encouraged you or discouraged you kind of along the way? So maybe you could just maybe you could talk about that.
You surround yourself with awesome people that want to be creative like that too. I guess I can say at the beginning of my career, I'm a smart design alum. And so I was surrounded by super smart and fun and creative people. So I think that was a big part of it that like allowed me to explore and try and fail and, you know, try again. So I think that's probably the number one, is make sure you've got some cool friends that are excited about it, and, you know, surround yourself with those people, and, you know, people you can bounce ideas off of too.
I think one thing that I still try to do today is, but especially in the early days, is try at least one new thing on each project. You know, there's like the ask of what you're given in a project, and then there's your ask of yourself. And I think those, you know, it needs to be a little bit greater. You know, if that's a new methodology that you've never tried, then sure, you need to practice it before you try it out on participants and things like that. So it's finding moments within projects to practice things, not having this whole list of things you need to practice outside of your work. The one that comes to mind, and it's not very research focused, sadly, but I was really into wanting to learn stop motion. And so for the output of our project, I did the whole thing in stop motion animation, which took so long, way too long. But it was the value to me of getting to kind of explore and try something new. Sadly, I couldn't think of a methodology example right away, but that's my advice. Try one new thing.
I think that's wonderful advice. I think that the constantly make, I feel has been a real service, and of community as well, to your point, Sarah, like a supportive community who's there to create places that are playful, you know, that aren't risky is of essence to keep going, you know, and that can even be just one person in your life, because sometimes it's tough, you know, if you're in job situations, but to find one safe place, one safe person to dream with. I think that personally continuing to dream and have like found I have found that ability to do that in my own work has been a real gift, but that has come through 10 million failures. Like I think there's also something to call out there is, I don't know any person who's working, you know, at the edge of their field who doesn't feel scared all the time. Like to this day, I still worry and wonder, and like, will it succeed? Will it be bad? Like those questions are forever there. And for me, what they have become is they have become signposts that I'm in the right spot because I am discovering. And if I don't know, that means that I'm in a mindset of learning. And that's a shift. It's a shift from going to fear to curiosity. And I think that's kind of the lifeline throughout our lives, you know, in work and in life, is that can you start to notice that within yourself? And can you personally have the power to change that? Because if you go into the unknown, which we are always in when we're growing and developing, with a sense of curiosity, there is success at the end of that road. You know, whatever form it takes, that is success. So I think that's maybe a little bit more of like the emotional undercurrent of it. But I know for me, that has really helped me, just a mindset shift throughout everything.
Great, that's really good advice there. So then the second question, actually had three people ask the same question in kind of different ways. So obviously this is an important one. So I'll just pick kind of one of them. So how do you convince client or business-minded stakeholders to utilize like creative methods? And then how do you explain the kind of findings or kind of the result? So I think in general, like obviously the business stakeholder is maybe the person everybody finds a little bit intimidating or scary, and we're going into this creative space. You know, what are some of the ways you've approached that?
I think one of the ways is you can make them do it. Put them through the practices, the methodologies. One example on that toilet cleaning project, we had, you know, high up people in the company very interested in the outcomes. So we got them engaged and involved. And one of the exercises we had them do was we brought in a toilet and we hid Velcro, the sticky dot Velcro all over the toilet so you couldn't really see them in the key places that people reach around and clean. And we made it a game for them whichever of them could discover how many dots there were on the toilet would win a prize. And so here we had, you know, the leaders in our organization crouching and reaching around the toilet and reaching down in the hole and, you know, doing all of that, but realizing like the posture and the experience of cleaning a toilet from this game, and realizing, through discussions afterwards, that sometimes it takes a little bit of unique approaches to really get a feel for what's going on. And anyway, put them through it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, participating in the research, but I also really like to have them participate in the synthesis as well. So they understand why we were doing what we're doing. So, they're experiencing that with people, or we're experiencing, the process, but then they're sitting in the room, they've got a stack of Post-its right there with them. And we're kind of working on it together to really talk about, what are we learning? What are the themes here? And so once they feel a bit more ownership over the process, then I think that's where you kind of, there's the unlock, giving them ownership. Because at the beginning of my career, I was like, keep them out of here. I don't really, and now I'm in the corporate world. I've been in the corporate world for half my career, but, you just need to kind of open up a little bit more and invite them into the process.
Yeah, I would chime in here. I think less personally from a research angle, but as close of relationships as you can develop with your clients, I think where they become stakeholders and participants as well, I think is really, really powerful. And by inviting them into prototypes, early previs experiences, all of that is really wonderful. I think there's also a fine line sometimes between then having that situation and then having a really crazy amount of cooks in the kitchen. So I think that there is a balance within that kind of a scenario where it's important to have some kind of guiding light, guiding thread, mission statement, whatever it is, creative direction that we're always going back to, so that the idea is present and there's a real awareness that you're always serving the idea. And I think going back to that has been helpful, as well as, this is sort of a strange thing to say, but I do think that you have to define at some point who makes the final choice too. Like, I think more and more and more we get into these group scenarios where it's like group mind, group think, co-creation, which is incredible for a certain part of the process. And then it's important to define who is that one person, or what is that singular voice or vision that we need to also go back and touch back to, or who will synthesize this finally, who will have final say. That I think is maybe a little bit more applicable to different parts of the process than research, but I think it is, from my own work, I think something that comes up as an important piece of it.
There is an element of education. I can't think of a different word that might be necessary. A lot of these kind of non-traditional methods, whatever you want to call them, they date back a long time. It's not new stuff. We're talking 60s and 70s, great stuff in research around using these methodologies. So there's plenty of material out there. If someone's a little more willing to dig in and learn about the approach and learn about kind of why it's valuable, and getting deeper and understanding more of what's going on inside people versus just what they say. So it's not just fun. It's also, there's foundation there in regards to human psychology and human behavior and all of that.
Great. So I think that's kind of what we had from the Q&A for now. So I know Catherine, you want to pick up the other questions?
Sure. Great. And I'll pause maybe a couple minutes ahead of time in case there's any other questions that come up. But I guess now I will ask the inevitable kind of COVID-19 question, which I feel like comes up in every panel. But it seems like a lot of this research, or a lot of what we've been talking about, really relies on kind of physical presence, whether it's building something, touching something, role-playing, prototyping, smelling, licking, all of these different kind of physical things. So I'm curious to hear from all of you, if you've had any experience running this kind of research remotely, or have just thought about, how you might do it. I'm curious to hear, what might be lost, and also what might be gained by doing some of this in a remote setting, or not in the room with someone.
I can jump in.
Great.
It feels like a plug, but I use this platform called Battery a lot. It ends Battery with 2 I's. It's awesome. It's a really great, it's like a mural or a muro, but you can also do research through the platform too, where people create walls and do and create like inspiration boards or, you know, different things, but also answer questions through video as well. And so I've used that. I like it quite a bit because you can talk to a lot of different people across the country. I think, you know, the benefits of it, or you can do a bit of longitudinal research. You know, you can kind of like talk to people over time and start to understand kind of how they could start to think about it a little bit, and either adjust their answers or think about it and in different contexts. Of course, everything, there's like kind of that face-to-face is lost a bit. Of course, it's like that, understanding the, behavior in the moment is lost. But, if anybody else has some great tools, I'd love to hear about them. It's just, it's a tough thing to be able to do, other than kind of just having conversations over Zoom. You can do that, of course, too, in addition. But yeah, it's just you have to be a little scrappy using different tools to be able to kind of piece it all together.
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's a lot of kind of for research tools out there that are great. D-Scout's one that I've used plenty of times. Anyway, but I tend to kind of lean towards the non-proprietary tools, texting and people capturing videos of themselves. I can text them a question and, take a picture right now of this. Like it can be a little more in the flow going on right now, which is great. But also things like just Google Slides, instead of having them introduced to Mural or something like that, where there's kind of new tools. It's like creating a PowerPoint presentation. We'll just be in here anyway. So those ones that are a little more, less of a learning curve to kind of get introduced for the participants, I tend to like, even though there's less capability from like a capturing and even cross analysis, things like that. Like I can take that information and do that on my own. Because they're familiar with it, and it's kind of natural to use that sort of thing. That's what I prefer.
It strikes me that now is actually a really interesting time, because we've broken all barriers between our digital and physical lives. So there really is permission to like be in someone's stuff all the time, and habits now have been formed that way too. So I think, just even from a practitioner standpoint, like it's much more than ever before. More content, more conversations are being generated and have to be generated to get communication across, but we're also more open to that than ever before as people. So I think it's an interesting opportunity in some ways.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and we started talking, Sarah, through your work a little bit about kind of sensors, but I know, Emily, in our last conversation, we mentioned things like chat bots, and there's a lot of, I think, applications of things like AR and VR, things that arise out of this kind of emerging technology world. So I'm curious to hear if you've had a chance to incorporate any of that into your work. Sarah, I know you mentioned sensors. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you use that in more of like a longitudinal.
Sure. Yeah, there's the footwear stuff that we do over time with sensors. There's also some climbing projects that we've done too, to kind of understand movement. So we design in layers when you're designing for top of mountain. So there's kind of the outer big puffy layer, then there's all the way down to your base layer. And so understanding, is there restricted movement, with different layers as you add layers? So how could we create, the most amount of movement for an athlete by like kind of hooking them up to all this kind of crazy stuff. So that was a pretty interesting project, and we do it over time, and we'd adjust the prototypes to be able to do that. You also mentioned virtual reality, and I think that that's going to be a really interesting space. I've kind of dabbled in that, kind of working with some companies that are building in virtual reality. But it gets really interesting when you think about like how you could potentially use that. I mean, this is more potential, but like potentially using virtual reality to prototype with people. There's this program I love to use, Tilt Brush. It's super fun. It feels like you're like painting and Burning Man is kind of like how I describe it to people. You're like in the middle of the desert, but imagine being in that space with someone else, building something and kind of like erasing things and, kind of adding. So kind of like that backpack idea that I was talking about, like imagine doing that in virtual reality and making it like 30 floors high, or you can really do anything in virtual reality. That's what I find really interesting about it. It could be a tiny, tiny world, or you could like imagine like eating something while you're like looking at food, and like you could, just the senses could explode. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah. One quick thought on that too. I think that there also are in-home opportunities. I mean, Colin called out, putting sensors in things that are being sent to people. We also have more and more smart homes now that, privacy and security issues aside, I've made a project that's a chatbot inside of Google Home that has conversations with you in home, and asks a variety of questions, and then based on that data set spits out a recipe that you create, which has all sorts of absurdity wrapped around it for the joy and the fun of making. But it was a really interesting, one of the surprising pieces of that, it didn't start out to be a research project, but ended up becoming one because of all the data that we were gathering from people's answers. And so it's also interesting, I think, to look at the spaces that people are in and leverage, what existing sensing technologies are there, and think about how we might use those also as research platforms.
With full consent and awareness that it's happening.
With full consent and awareness. Yes.
Great. Well, I have one last question to wrap on, and I think we have a couple of other questions from the audience. But I think looking forward, kind of thinking about this type of research that we've been discussing, and kind of how the nature of this participatory research is changing, and how people are using more and more creative research methodologies. What new skills do you think would be important for the future of designers and researchers to have going forward?
Mm-hmm.
What's hard is that, my thoughts on this are that it is hard to always keep up with the newest, coolest, what the cool kid on the block's up to with technology. So I think number one is just keep those skills around, knowing the right people. So those people that know the latest and greatest, but based around, kind of at the core of all this technology is still, story loving, irrational humans. And so kind of the notions around understanding how stories might change in new technology and new environments, in mixed realities, understanding how behavior and choice is different or evolving based on kind of those implications. So I don't try to, be an expert on all these emerging technologies, but personally, I try to just keep up to date on what are they, how do they kind of influence behavior and culture, so that I can understand its role in the context of whatever topic I'm digging into. That's my personal approach to preparing for the future. But I love to hear what Sarah and Emily have to say.
Yeah, it's not a new skill, but I think that, because, and I do a lot of research around kind of like, I'm doing a lot of alpha and Gen Z research around kind of like kids spending time in front of screens and how like socially things are going to get really weird with them. And I think about like my little guy. So I think that idea of just like empathy and listening and kind of like having conversations face to face are going to be so important and maybe novel, but just being able to like continue to be able to do that is going to be so important, because I think a lot of the communication is going to be digital, and we're going to be using technology to do all of these things. So I think, but being able to understand another human and being able to have a great conversation with another human is going to be a skill that we're going to need.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that there's a real, like the base of that, from what I hear from both of you, is a learning mindset. So to continue fostering that at all points, be a sponge, be omnivorous, learn as much as you can, be curious. And I also think about, some of the things that we have been talking about outside of technology is fluency, even in technology, like new technology becoming fluent, at least in what is available. But I think it really helps to continue to develop lateral fluency, like as many different languages, quote unquote, that you can learn about. If you can take a perfumery class to understand how scent communicates, if you can dig a little bit deeper into human psychology, if you can take some dance classes to understand how the body works and what you know, physical expression represents. Like there's so many incredible tools also now. And, you know, with the digital landscape, like we have access to more of that than ever. Something that I find is always wonderful, especially in these kinds of scenarios, is to be able to speak many, many languages. Because specifically as a researcher and as a creator, the more that you can communicate with more stakeholders, you will not only be able to communicate to them, but you will also be able to understand them. And so that goes back to being able to glean insights. The more nuanced and aware of how we communicate we can become, I think, you know, we're not just better people. I think we also are better designers and researchers at that.
Richard, I think we have one or two more questions. So
yeah. We have one last question. So yeah, first of all, aren't we lucky to work in this amazing field? How exciting. So this is just a more general question about remote research. So when conducting research remotely, how do you ensure you're getting true data and not just what the test subject thinks they want you to hear and see? It's a great question. Anyone want to pick that one up?
I'd ask the same when you're having a face-to-face conversation. The same facade can exist in that situation as well. I don't think there's a foolproof answer in my experience. I think it's a matter of, you can ask follow-up questions, you can try to dig deeper. They can continue to put whatever false front they want on. Anyway, and you know, data is in my experience is not about just the individual, it's about the collective set. And I think looking at the set, you would be able to get a feel for kind of weird data. And that would be my kind of litmus test for that.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, digitally, I think, or kind of virtually, it's just collecting a large enough amount of data to be able to kind of look at those patterns, but then also asking questions in different ways or having different activities that kind of get at questions in different ways to kind of suss some of that stuff out. I think I'll have that question for the rest of my career. So I'm not sure how to answer that.
Just haunting you, yeah.
Yeah.
Is it real? Yeah. You know, one technique sometimes that I think is interesting, and I'm going to speak, you know, in parallel to this because I feel like Sarah and Colin are much more experts in this field than I, but is a slight provocation in those moments, because, you know, you sort of like, we're all used to the faking it till you make it. So there is a bit of performance in everyone all the time. The interesting stuff starts to happen when you take someone out of their environment. You know, I think the examples of Colin's toilet brush exercise, you know, playful environments, put people in different states of mind. And sometimes within that, if there aren't a lot of reference points, they will start being more open, more transparent, and not rely on, you know, expected performances or known ideas. So I think it's also interesting sometimes to just shift the context to get people really out of expectations, because that's where that behavior often comes from. Like wanting to be right is, you know, people are often afraid. Like am I going to be wrong?
Right.
Right. So that's where a lot of that, you know, like performative behavior, I think, comes from psychologically. So what can we do to mediate that upfront?
Yeah, students in the classroom, you know, they're so used to, there's a right answer, let me fill out the questionnaire, let me fill out the test. But when you disorient them, like you mentioned, Emily, that it puts them in a totally new space. And first off, they don't know how to react. And then they figure out, oh, you actually want me to be a human and be me. That's great. And I think similar applies to research settings for sure.
So there's a good follow-up question here, which is, where did everyone learn these soft skills like conversation, learning mindset? And then how do you kind of pass them on?
Ask every parent that around the world. Oh my God.
That's what I was thinking, my parents.
Yeah, no pressure, but also, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about that myself now as a parent. I did learn them around the dinner table, I'll be perfectly frank. You know, like these are qualities that I admired in my parents because I saw what it did to their lives, what it created in terms of social relationships, the kind of intimacy it created in their own conversation, the bond I felt with them. So for me, it started in a very emotional and, you know, very small place, which was a family setting. And then, you know, and throughout time, those became the values that I upheld. I still value that. I value curiosity. I value dialogue and conversation with people. I value learning, because those were the values that I grew up with. I think practically speaking, how that gets shared is obviously, you know, one is just a mirroring effect, like be that person in the world. That's I think a really powerful way. And then also try to be part of what I'm interested in experience design is I'm also interested in understanding how that is created, because I think we can learn things subconsciously, you know, through the environments that we're in. How does that get created? How does that get replicated? And breaking that down, you know, observing your own lives, trying to understand, well, why do I feel this way? Or why did that work and this didn't? And as designers, I think that that's one of the great things, that we come with a critical mindset and an observational mindset. So there's lots of wonderful tools, I think, inherently in the process of design that show us also how to analyze, observe, and then in a sense, like teach back, you know. And so that, I don't have any specific frameworks for that, but it is a practice that I try to do myself, to deconstruct and then, you know, reconstruct. Why does this happen? How can it happen again? How can I share it with someone else?
Yeah, just like Emily, I grew up in a really big extended family, like a big Italian family. So it was just like conversations and chatting with different people. And then additionally, my mother was a kindergarten teacher. So that's where the playful aspect of kind of design research comes into play. I always ask her, like, oh, how would you do this with kids? And, you know, kind of looking for different creative, like, you know, ways that she uses like STEM to like help, you know, get a point across. So I use some of that. And then also just kind of how to embody it. Working in the corporate world, you kind of have to be that person. You have to share your stories. You have to, like, I invite people to presentations all the time so they can see stuff and, you know, let them know it's okay to be creative, and you can, you know, ask weird questions, and, you know, really valuable stuff comes out of it.
I found it really helpful to, when I see someone that is doing something in a way that I think I would like to, whether that's lead an interview conversation and research or facilitate a workshop or whatever it might be, is acknowledging first, I admire what they're doing and how they're doing it. And then sometimes it's appropriate to reach out and ask, you know, how did you gain that skill? How did you practice that? And if not, just being kind of a secret, let them be your secret mentor. You know, they don't know they're teaching you, but they are. And then the flip side of that is be willing to share when people ask. You know, there's times where it's appropriate to reach out and suggest advice on how to do things to certain people, depending on the relationship. But oftentimes, you know, when people ask you, you got to make time for being willing to talk it out, share resources. I always try to share any of the resources I've ever received, and that just kind of becomes a community of sharing, whether that's on LinkedIn or just group conversations on Slack or whatever it might be.
Great. Well, sadly, our time is up, but thank you to all the panelists today. I mean, I speak from personal experience. I think like one creative person in an organization or a group can just have a massive impact on the whole morale, the whole organization. And I can see that each one of you has done that. So thank you so much for your time. I'm just going to do a quick plug for the next Salon, which hopefully, I don't know if everyone can see this, but we're shifting topics. So Catherine was actually really involved in like some of this work, but we are moving on to the topic of sustainability. And the first event, which is going to be on Tuesday, March the 23rd, is going to be focused on some research that we did, sort of exploring perceptions of sustainability among different people, sort of contrasting some of the actual sustainable activities with the way that people think about them and kind of perceive them. And we'll be having a discussion mixing sort of brand leaders and also people from an environmental perspective, and think about how we can get consumers more involved in sustainability, the recycling process, and ultimately making a meaningful impact. So if you are interested in learning more about this, there is a link on the website. There was an article in Fast Company that came out recently that contains some of the results from the survey. So if you want to take a look at that, you can do a bit of pre-reading, and we will look forward to seeing you again on March the 23rd. Thank you very much, everybody.